The twin suns of the moribunda Odo system were just beginning their synchronized rise over the horizon of Orlia Prime when Commander Randall Vickers checked his chronometer for the third time. 4:30 hours local time. Perfect. The atmospheric ionization would be at its peak, creating natural interference patterns that might, just might, give his squadron a ghost of a chance. "Ironclaw Squadron, this is lead," he transmitted through the encrypted channel, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "Systems check. All wings report." One by one, 5 voices crackled through his helmet speakers. His squadron of 6 Ironclaw heavy bombers, relics from the Third Colonial War 40 years past, sat powered down on the hidden launch platform. Their angular hulls looked like sleeping predators in the pre-dawn darkness. The ships were old, their atmospheric processors wheezing, their targeting computers running on processes that belonged in a museum. But they were all the Outer Rim Coalition had. "Mr. Garrett, you reading those atmospheric conditions?" Vickers asked his wingman. "Ionization at 78% and climbing, Commander," Lieutenant Samuel Garrett replied, his southern drawl somehow surviving 3 decades in space. "If we're going to thread this needle, now's the time." Vickers nodded to himself. The Terran Federation had established an exclusion zone around the entire moribunda Odo system 6 months ago, declaring it a pacification sector after the Outer Rim worlds refused to accept the new taxation protocols. Any ship entering Federation-controlled space without proper clearance would be destroyed on sight. The Federation's Falcon-class gunships, sleek, deadly, and equipped with the latest targeting arrays, patrolled the zone in rotating shifts. "All right, people," Vickers announced. "Remember the drill. We stay low, use the ionosphere's interference, hit the munitions depot at checkpoint Sigma and get out. The plasma charges we're carrying are dumb fire only. You'll need visual confirmation before release. No fancy computer targeting on these old birds." "Commander," came the voice of Lieutenant Zachary Cromwell from Ironclaw 3, "my threat detector's been acting up again. If those Falcons show up—" "They won't," Vickers cut him off, though he knew it was more hope than certainty. "Intelligence says the patrol window gives us 20 minutes. We'll be in and out in 15. And if intelligence is wrong," this from Captain Henrietta Moss, flying Ironclaw 5. She was the oldest pilot in the squadron at 63, had been flying combat missions since before Vickers was born. "Then we improvise," Vickers replied, "like we always do." The pilots performed their final checks in practice silence. Each Ironclaw bomber measured 120 feet from nose to tail, with swept-back wings designed for atmospheric flight and bulbous engine pods that hadn't been manufactured in 2 decades. Their armor plating was thick but outdated, designed to withstand laser fire, not the new gravitic missiles the Falcons carried. "This is insane," muttered Lieutenant Winston Jeff in Ironclaw 6. "My daughter's Academy flight simulator has better specs than these ships." "Cut the chatter, Jeff," Garrett said. "We all volunteered for this." "Yeah, because someone had to," Jeff shot back. "Doesn't mean I have to like flying a ship older than my marriage." "Your marriage is 3 years old," Cromwell pointed out. "Exactly." Despite himself, Vickers smiled. Gallows humor, the fighter pilot's best friend since humans first took to the skis on old Earth. "Engines to standby," he ordered. "We launch in 30 seconds." The Ironclaw's fusion reactors hummed to life, their distinctive whine filling the cockpits. Vickers ran his hands over the manual controls, actual switches and levers, not the neural interfaces the Falcon pilots used. There was something comforting about the tactile feedback, the way the stick vibrated in his grip. "Lead, this is 4, came the voice of Lieutenant Marcus Halstead. "I'm showing a power fluctuation in my starboard engine. Can you compensate?" "I think so. Might have to ride her a little harder than usual." "Do what you have to do. 10 seconds to launch." Vickers took a deep breath, tasting the recycled air that always carried a hint of ozone and metal. The mission was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. The Federation's munitions depot at Checkpoint Sigma supplied their entire fleet in this sector. One successful strike could cripple their operations for months, maybe force them to negotiate with the Outer Rim worlds as equals instead of conquered territories. "Launch," Vickers commanded. 6 Ironclaws lifted off in perfect formation, their engines creating columns of superheated air that turned the launch platform's permacrete to glass. They stayed low, barely 500 feet above the canyon systems that crisscrossed Orlia Prime's northern continent. The planet's unusual magnetosphere played havoc with sensors, which was why the Coalition had chosen it as their staging ground. "Maintaining radio silence from here on," Vickers transmitted. "Hand signals and emergency burst only." The squadron flew in 3 pairs, each pair separated by half a mile. Vickers and Garrett took point, their ship's belly cameras scanning the terrain rushing beneath them. The canyons gave way to plains, the plains to the industrial sector where Checkpoint Sigma squatted like a metal mountain. 20 miles out, Garrett's ship waggled its wings, the signal for visual confirmation of target. Vickers could see it now through his scratched canopy, a massive complex of warehouses and loading docks, with the distinctive pyramid shape of the munitions depot at its center. Anti-aircraft batteries dotted the perimeter, but they were automated systems relying on sensor locks that the ionosphere should confuse. Vickers armed his payload, 6 plasma charges, each one powerful enough to vaporize a city block. The Ironclaws had to climb to 2,000 feet for the bombing run, putting them above the ionosphere's densest layer. It would make them visible to any Federation sensors in range, but there was no other way. The charges needed a clear trajectory. "Climbing to attack altitude," he announced, pulling back on the stick. The 6 bombers rose like ancient birds of prey, their formation tight despite the turbulence. Vickers watched his altitude gauge climb, 1500, 1800. That's when his threat detector screamed. "Federation signatures," Cromwell shouted over the emergency channel. 2 Falcons, bearing 320-50 miles and closing fast. Vickers' blood ran cold. 50 miles. At the Falcons' top speed, they'd be on them in less than 2 minutes. "Continue the run," he ordered. "We're too close to abort." Through his canopy, he could see them now, 2 specks on the horizon growing larger with terrifying speed. The Falcon-class gunships were everything the Ironclaws weren't: sleek, modern, with variable geometry, wings, and engines that could push them to 15 times the speed of sound in atmosphere. Their gravitic missiles could lock onto a target from 30 miles away and adjust course mid-flight to guarantee a kill. "Lead, this is Black 7, came a new voice over the squadron's frequency, calm, professional, with the distinctive accent of the Federation's core worlds. "You are in violation of Federation Exclusion Zone Alpha 7. Reverse course immediately or we will engage." "Steady," Vickers told his squadron, though his hands were slick with sweat inside his flight gloves. "Stay on course." The Falcons streaked past them in a thunderous roar, one on each side of the formation. The shock wave from their passage rattled the Ironclaw's frames, and Jeff's ship briefly lost stability before he recovered. "Son of a, did you see that?" Jeff gasped. "They must have been doing 12,000 miles per hour. "Focus on the target," Garrett barked. The Ironclaw's bombing computers were primitive, but they worked. Green lights flashed on Vickers' panel as the depot entered optimal release parameters. Through his optical sight, a simple crosshair that wouldn't have looked out of place in a war from 2 centuries ago, he watched the target slide into position. "Bombs away," he announced, toggling the release. 6 ships dropped their payloads simultaneously. 36 plasma charges fell toward the depot in a deadly rain. Vickers watched them fall for a heartbeat, then yanked his stick hard to port. "Evasive maneuvers, get low, use the terrain." But even as the Ironclaws dove for the deck, Vickers knew they were out of time. The Falcons had circled back, and this time they weren't making a warning pass. Black 7 engaging, the Federation pilot announced with the detached tone of someone ordering coffee. Weapons free. On Vickers' scope, he saw one of the Falcons align itself behind Cromwell and Halstead. A second later, a gravitic missile separated from the Falcon's wing. "Missile lock," Halstead screamed. "I can't shake it." The missile adjusted its trajectory 3 times in the span of 2 seconds, matching every desperate maneuver Halstead attempted. It struck his Ironclaw's port engine, the gravitic warhead crushing the metal like an invisible fist before the conventional explosive finished the job. Half the wing simply ceased to exist. "Marcus is hit," Cromwell shouted. "He's going down." Through the chaos, Vickers forced himself to watch their bombs impact. The depot erupted in a chain of explosions, each one triggering the next as stored munitions cooked off. The blast wave was visible from 15 miles away, an expanding sphere of destruction that flattened everything within a mile radius. "Target destroyed," he reported, though the victory felt hollow as he watched Halstead's ship spiral toward the ground, leaving a trail of burning fuel. "No ejection, no shoot." "Break, break, break," Garrett was shouting. The Ironclaws scattered in 5 different directions, each pilot pushing their ancient engines beyond safe limits. Vickers dove toward a canyon system, the ground rushing up at him fast enough to make his vision tunnel. Behind him, he could hear the distinctive whine of a Falcon's engines. He pulled up at the last possible second, his landing skids actually sparking against a rock formation. The canyon walls blurred past on either side, barely 50 feet from his wingtips. His threat detector was going crazy. The Falcon was right on him. "This is Black 7. Impressive flying for such an old ship," the Federation pilot commented, sounding almost amused. "But this game's over." A gravitic missile launched. Vickers threw his ship into a barrel roll, dumping chaff and flares, useless against gravitic targeting, but old habits died hard. The missile adjusted, locked, adjusted again, and struck a power line stretched across the canyon. The explosion was close enough to pepper Vickers' hull with shrapnel warning lights flashing across his console, but he was still flying. More importantly, the Falcon had overshot, its superior speed working against it in the confined space. "I'm hit but still flying," he reported, wrestling with controls that had gone sluggish. "All units report." "This is 2, Garrett responded, breathing hard. "That fancy Federation boy is trying to line up on me, but these canyons are too narrow for his boat. Not so tough when you can't use all that speed, are you?" "5 here," Captain Moss added, her voice steady as always. "I've got one trying to get a lock, but I'm threading the needle through some industrial towers. These Falcon jockeys don't know how to fly dirty." "6 still alive," Jeff chimed in, "though I think I left my lunch somewhere over Sector 12. 3, Vickers called. "Cromwell, report." "Silence." "Cromwell's gone," Moss said quietly. "Saw him take a direct hit. He didn't make it out." 2 down. Vickers gritted his teeth, pushing his damaged ship harder. The Federation pilots were good, too good, and their equipment advantage was overwhelming. But the Ironclaws had one thing the Falcons didn't: desperation. "New plan," Vickers announced. "We can't outrun them and we can't outfight them, but we can outthink them. Garrett, remember the Titan's gambit." There was a pause. "Commander, that's insane even by our standards." "You got a better idea." "Negative." "Then form up on me. Moss, Jeff, keep them busy for 30 more seconds." Vickers pulled his Ironclaw out of the canyon, climbing hard despite his damaged engine's protests. Garrett appeared on his wing, their ship so close Vickers could see the other pilot through his canopy. Behind them, one of the Falcons immediately began pursuit. "Black 8 moving to engage 2 bandits climbing," the second Federation pilot reported. "These old-timers don't know when to quit. Maintained by the book engagement protocols, Black 7 responded. Command wants this clean. That was their weakness, Vickers realized. The Federation pilots were flying by the manual, treating this like a training exercise. They'd probably never faced an enemy that had nothing left to lose. Now, Vickers shouted. He and Garrett split apart at the last second, their ships passing on either side of a communications tower. The Falcon, traveling at 3 times their speed, tried to adjust but clipped the tower with its starboard wing. The damage was minimal. These ships were built tough, but it forced the pilot to reduce speed for damage assessment. Black 8 reporting minor strike, continuing engagement. Confirmed, I'm closing on the other 2. Moss and Jeff were weaving between industrial smokestacks, using the thermal columns to mask their heat signatures. It was old-school flying, the kind they didn't teach at the Federation academies anymore. But the Falcon pilot was learning fast, anticipating their moves, closing the gap with each passing second. Can't shake him, Jeff reported, his voice cracking. He's got me dialed in. Hold on, Winston, Moss said. She pulled her Ironclaw into a vertical climb, then cut her engines entirely. The ship hung in the air for an impossible moment before falling backward, dropping behind the pursuing Falcon. What the Federation pilot started to say. Moss fired her forward cannons, ancient projectile weapons that wouldn't scratch a Falcon's shields at range, but at point blank, they could damage external sensors. The Falcon's pilot, startled by the unorthodox maneuver, banked hard right, directly into Jeff's flight path. The collision was spectacular. Both ships tumbled through the air, shields sparking as they fought to repel each other. Jeff's Ironclaw, being significantly heavier, came out better. His port side was crumpled but functional. The Falcon spun away, its pilot fighting for control. Black 8, I'm hit. Collision with enemy craft losing altitude. Eject. Vickers saw the Falcon's canopy blow off, the pilot rocketing away in an ejection seat as the sophisticated gunship carved a burning furrow through an abandoned warehouse district. One down, Jeff whooped, though his celebration was cut short by a coughing fit. Though I think I broke some ribs. Can you make it home? Vickers asked. I'll crawl if I have to. But their minor victory was short-lived. Black 7 had regrouped and was coming in fast, and Vickers could see 2 more Falcon signatures on his scope, reinforcements from the orbital station. Lead, we've got company, Garrett warned. 2 more Falcons inbound, 8 minutes out. 8 minutes? They'd never make it back to Coalition space in 8 minutes, not with damaged ships and a very angry Federation pilot on their tails. Listen up, Vickers said, making a decision that went against every instinct he had. We split up, every pilot for themselves. Best chance for some of us to make it home. Commander, Moss started. That's an order, Captain. Scatter pattern Delta, go. The 4 remaining Ironclaws broke formation, each heading in a different direction. Vickers turned his ship toward the mountains, hoping the mineral deposits might interfere with sensors. Behind him, Black 7 had to choose a target. The Falcon chose Garrett. He's on me, Garrett called out, his voice tight with fear. Those mountains, Samuel, use the mountains, Vickers urged. Garrett's Ironclaw dove toward the mountain range, the Falcon matching him move for move. A gravitic missile launched, tracked, adjusted. I can't shake it, tell my wife. The explosion cut him off mid-sentence. Vickers' last view of his wingman was a fireball against the morning sky. Samuel, Vickers roared, rage overwhelming his training. He yanked his stick around, pointing his nose directly at the Falcon. It was suicide, his ancient cannons against the Falcon's shields and missiles, but he didn't care. You want some of this? He snarled, squeezing the trigger. Bullets sparked harmlessly off the Falcon's shields, but it forced the pilot to evade, breaking off his attack run on Moss. Commander, what are you doing? Moss demanded. Buying time. "Get Jeff home, Captain, that's an order." He kept firing, his ammunition counter dropping toward zero, until the Falcon pilot apparently decided enough was enough. A gravitic missile launched, and Vickers knew with absolute certainty he was about to die. The missile struck and didn't explode. Warning lights flashed across his console: hull breach, atmospheric leak, navigation offline, but he was alive. The missile had been set to disable, not destroy. Ironclaw lead Black 7's voice came through the static. "You're done. Land now or I finish this." Vickers looked at his instruments. His ship was dying, losing altitude despite his best efforts. But in the distance, he could see Moss and Jeff approaching Coalition space, almost home free. "You know what?" Vickers said into his comm. "I don't think I will." He pointed his nose at the ground and pushed the throttle forward. If he was going down, he'd do it on his terms. The ground rushed up, spinning, and for a moment he thought about Samuel Garrett's wife, about Cromwell's kids, about all the families that would get visits from officers in dress uniforms. At the last second, some instinct made him pull back on the stick. Not enough to recover. He was too low, too fast, but enough to change a vertical impact into an angled crash. The Ironclaw hit the ground, bounced, hit again, and started tumbling. The last thing Vickers saw before blacking out was his canopy shattering into 1,000 pieces. He woke up 3 hours later in a Federation medical facility, restrained to a bed with a neural inhibitor around his neck. A man in a Federation flight suit sat in a chair nearby, young, maybe 25, with the kind of clean-cut features they put on recruitment posters. "Commander Vickers," the pilot said. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Ford, call sign Black 7. How are you feeling?" "Like I crashed a spaceship," Vickers croaked. Ford smiled slightly. "You very nearly didn't crash it. That was some impressive flying. Stupid but impressive." "My people. 2 made it back to Coalition space. 2 didn't, and you're here." Ford stood up, walked to the window overlooking a Federation base. "The depot you hit will be rebuilt in 3 months. Your sacrifice accomplished nothing." "We showed you could be hit," Vickers said, "that you're not invincible." "No, you showed that brave pilots in obsolete ships can die just as easily as cowards." Ford turned back to him. "The war's over, Commander. Your coalition signed a ceasefire agreement an hour ago. The destruction of that depot, the loss of your pilots, it was all for nothing." Vickers closed his eyes. 4 pilots dead for a ceasefire that was probably already being negotiated when they launched. "It wasn't for nothing," he said quietly. "We flew because someone had to, because sometimes you have to fight even when you can't win, just to prove you're still willing to fight." Ford studied him for a long moment. "I suppose there's something to that." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Commander, in different circumstances, I would have been honored to fly with you. Any of you." After Ford left, Vickers stared at the ceiling, thinking about his lost pilots. Halstead, who'd never see his daughter graduate from the academy. Cromwell, with his broken threat detector and quick laugh. Garrett, his friend for 15 years, who died buying time for others to escape. And somewhere out there, Moss and Jeff had made it home. 2 survivors out of 6 volunteers. In the cold mathematics of war, it was a disaster. But they'd shown the Federation that the outer rim wouldn't go quietly, that there were still pilots willing to strap themselves into flying antiques and face down the most advanced fighters in human space. A nurse came in to check his vitals, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "You should rest, Commander. You've been through a lot." "Ma'am," Vickers said, "do you know what happened to my ship, the Ironclaw?" She looked surprised. "The wreckage, I believe it's in the salvage yard. Why?" "Those ships," Vickers said, his voice growing heavy as sedatives kicked in, "they deserve better than a salvage yard. They carried us when nothing else would, carried us all the way to the end." The nurse patted his hand gently. "I'll see what I can do." As Vickers drifted off to sleep, He thought he could hear engines in the distance. Not the smooth whine of falcons, but the distinctive rumble of ironclaws, flying forever through his dreams, carrying their pilots home. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Ford stood in a coalition cemetery on Orlia Prime. The war was over. The Federation had withdrawn to agreed-upon boundaries, and both sides were counting their dead. He'd come alone, out of uniform, to pay his respects. 4 headstones stood in a row: Lieutenant Samuel Garrett, Lieutenant Zachary Cromwell, Lieutenant Marcus Halstead, Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell, the pilot he'd shot down, who ejected but whose chute had failed. Ford placed a small Federation flight pin on each headstone, the wings gleaming in the morning sun. Colonel Ford. He turned to find an elderly woman in a coalition flight suit. Captain Henrietta Moss, according to her name tag. She walked with a slight limp, probably from her crash landing after the raid. "Captain," he acknowledged, "I came too." "I know why you came," she said, not unkindly. "Same reason I come here every day." They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the graves. "They were good pilots," Ford finally said. "They deserved better equipment." "They were excellent pilots," Moss corrected. "And they flew what we had. That's what pilots do." "I've put in a recommendation," Ford said, "to have them recognized by the Federation, a formal acknowledgement of their courage." Moss snorted. The Federation honoring the people who bombed their depot. Honoring pilots who did their duty against impossible odds. Ford met her gaze. "It's the least we can do." "The least you could have done was not shoot them down." "And the least they could have done was not violate the exclusion zone," Ford sighed. "We all did what we had to do, Captain. That's what makes it a tragedy instead of a crime." Moss was quiet for a long moment. "Commander Vickers, have you heard anything?" "He's being treated well. He'll probably be released in the prisoner exchange next month." Ford paused. "He asked me to tell you something if I saw you. He said the Ironclaws flew true to the end." "That they did," Moss agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "That they surely did." As Ford walked back to his transport, he looked up at the morning sky where 2 suns were rising, painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere up there, patrol flights of Falcons were maintaining the peace, their pilots young and confident in their superior machines. But Ford had learned something in that brief, vicious battle. Technology and training could win fights, but courage, raw, desperate courage, could make even a losing fight mean something. The Ironclaw pilots had known they were outmatched, known they would probably die, and they'd flown anyway. "Sir," his transport pilot looked concerned. "Are you ready to depart?" Ford took one last look at the cemetery. "Yeah, let's go home." As the transport lifted off, Ford thought about his report to Fleet Command. He'd written about the tactical success, the minimal Federation losses, the depot being rebuilt ahead of schedule. But he'd also written about 6 pilots in obsolete bombers who'd reminded him why humans had once been called magnificent bastards by the first aliens they'd encountered, because they never knew when to quit. The transport climbed toward orbit, leaving Orlia Prime behind. But the memory of that morning, of Ironclaws falling like burning stars, would stay with Harrison Ford for the rest of his career. Every time he climbed into his Falcon, he'd remember Commander Vickers' words: "Sometimes you have to fight even when you can't win." And sometimes, Ford thought, that's the most important time to fight of all. Back on Orlia Prime, Winston Jeff sat in a bar near the spaceport, his ribs still wrapped in medical tape. He was on his 3rd beer when the news feed showed footage of the prisoner exchange. There was Vickers, thinner but walking tall, saluting the coalition flag as he crossed back into friendly territory. "That your commander?" the bartender asked, recognizing Jeff's flight suit. "Yeah," Jeff said, raising his glass. "That's him." "Heard he flew an Ironclaw into the ground, rather than surrender." "He flew it as far as it would go," Jeff corrected. just like we all did. The bartender poured him another beer on the house. My nephew flies interceptors now. Says you old claw pilots were crazy. Not crazy, Jeff said. Just willing, there's a difference. He drank in silence after that, thinking about friends who'd never drink again, about ships that would never fly again, about a morning raid that had changed everything and nothing all at once. Outside, night was falling over Orlia Prime, and the first stars were becoming visible. Somewhere among them, the wreckage of Ironclaws and one Falcon drifted forever, monuments to a brief, brutal moment when obsolete bombers had challenged the future, and for just a few minutes had made it blink. The official history would record it as a minor skirmish. 6 obsolete bombers against modern fighters, a foregone conclusion with a predictable outcome. But for those who were there, who saw the Ironclaws rise into the dawn sky on their final mission, it was something more. It was the last flight of warriors who knew they were outmatched, outgunned, and out of time, but who flew anyway, because duty demanded it, because their people needed them to, because sometimes the measure of a pilot isn't in the ship they fly, but in their willingness to fly it. Years later, when the Federation and Coalition had become allies against a greater threat, the Academy would teach the Battle of Checkpoint Sigma as a case study in asymmetric warfare. Cadets would study the tactics, analyze the decisions, debate whether the raid was worth the cost. But they'd miss the most important lesson, that on a morning when the smart money was on running, 6 pilots in ancient bombers had chosen to fight. And in doing so, they'd proven that courage could still matter in an age of technological superiority, that determination could still shake empires, and that sometimes the old ways of war, pilot, plane, and purpose were all you needed to make history. Commander Randall Vickers would go on to fly again, eventually commanding a joint Federation Coalition task force. But he never forgot the Ironclaws, never forgot the morning they'd risen into the dawn sky on wings of duty and determination. And on quiet nights, when young pilots asked him about fear, about facing impossible odds, he'd tell them about 6 volunteers in obsolete bombers who'd known they probably wouldn't come home but who'd flown anyway. Because that's what pilots do, he'd say. We fly what we have as far as it will go for as long as we can. Everything else is just details. The Ironclaws never flew again, but in the hearts of those who remembered, they flew forever, ancient guardians rising into the dawn, carrying their pilots toward duty, toward honor, toward the last full measure of devotion. And that, more than any victory, was their legacy.